This video is a representation of how I am going to work on my bike. That means that if I make a mistake, well, that's on me. Likewise, what you do to your bike, well, that's on you. Okay then, removal and refitting of brake pads and brake discs on the Gen 1 YZF R125. This is my 2011 Gen 1. And I specifically say Gen 1 because I know that from 2014 onwards, the Gen 2 onwards also had ABS, and so the procedure may differ slightly. I also know that the very first year of this bike, the 2008 model, also had a different rear brake caliper setup. So please bear all of this in mind if you are going to work on your bike. Now, if you are just doing the brake pads, then you could probably get away with doing this with the bike on his side stand. But since I'm going to be having the wheels off, and if you're going to be doing discs, you're going to want your bike up on stands. Now at the front, I use a headstock stand because I think they're safer and it makes removal of the front wheel a lot easier. And on the rear, I have a simple stand. And because Yamaha failed to drill and tap the swing arm for spools, I just have the standard L-shaped brackets underneath the swing arm, which on the right-hand side makes everything a little bit tight because the stand is right up against the exhaust, and it has to be, otherwise you wouldn't actually get your socket onto your axle nut there. So it is very, very tight there. If you take a look up just above your caliper, you will see a bracket holding your brake pipe on. Now, if you remove that, it'll give you a lot more flexibility. You'll be able to move the caliper a lot more. So for the sake of one 10mm bolt, it is worth removing it. And the caliper itself is held in with two 13mm bolts. And with those two bolts off, the caliper should just slide off. It'll be slightly tight because it is close to the disc. And now you can see how having that bracket removed really does help with the movement of the caliper here. The brake pads are held in place by a pin at the bottom of the caliper, and the pin itself is held in place with two retaining pins. And they say to make sure when you're refitting this that you get the orientation correct. So make a note of how yours are fitted, and the pins should just pull out. And then the pin itself should just push out. It might need some persuading if it hasn't been removed in a while. But that's the pin itself, and you can see the pads have just sprung out slightly. They are eager to be removed, these pads are. Again, keep the orientation. You can't really put these in the wrong way around. Whenever I have my calipers detached and I have my pads out, I do like to give them a good clean. When your caliper is nice and clean and you're ready to move on to the next step, they say don't leave your caliper just dangling there because you will put unnecessary strain on the brake pipe. Instead, you're meant to tie it up somewhere. So with me, having the stand that I've got, I know that I can tie my caliper up onto the stand. Now, my brake pads don't actually need replacing, but whilst they're off, I am going to just give them a quick clean up. So the pads are now nice and clean and ready to go back on. I've also cleaned up the pin and the pin clips. Now, I'm not fitting new pads, so I can just simply refit these into my caliper. However, if you're fitting new pads, they're going to be thicker than the ones that you're taking off, and so there won't actually be enough room in here for a set of new pads, and so you would have to push your pistons back into the caliper. There is special tools you can use to do this, but I've always found just simply some sort of lever bar, giant screwdriver, something like that will allow these pistons to go back into the caliper. But before you do that, It may be worth checking the fluid level in your master cylinder. You might be fine, you may just be able to push those pistons back into the caliper and not have any issues. But if you've got too much fluid in your system, then you will struggle and you may have to siphon some of the fluid out. If you want to check, 2 screws, remove the cap, and inside you'll find a thing called a diaphragm. Remove that and then you'll be able to see how much fluid you've actually got in your system and whether you need to siphon any out. When you push the pistons back in, fluid level will rise slightly. Check it again before putting your diaphragm back in and your cap back on. My pads are ready to go back in. The reason why I've got a piece of clean kitchen roll here is because I am going to put the pads face down and I don't want to contaminate the friction material. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because you are supposed to put a little bit of copper grease on the contact points. Personally, I also like to put the smallest amount just on this contact point here. And there is a brake grease that you can get for these pins, which unfortunately I don't have, but I don't want to fit it with nothing. So the smallest amount of copper grease is going onto this pin. This pin goes in from the outside, and this is what I've found when I've done this before. If you fit this one first up against the caliper, you can kind of hold it in with the pin a little bit. Just there. Maybe backed off slightly. That'll stop that one dropping out. Then this one goes in next. Pin straight through. You may have to turn your pin slightly so that your retaining pins can actually go in. There's one, and the other one back in as well. So that caliper is ready to be refitted. Let's hang it back up because now we're going to remove the wheel and the disc. Caliper bolts. These also need cleaning because when you fit the caliper you need thread lock, which is what all this residue on the end of the bolts is. So better off cleaning that off before you refit them. Front wheel removal then. I would say there's a degree of personal preference that comes into play here. I like to put something under my wheel to stop it from falling. You could just let it drop. Sometimes it does because the wood falls out of place. There's specialist tools that you can get for putting under the wheel, which I don't have. Sometimes I wish I did. When you remove the wheel, you have to consider your wheel speed sensor just there because that will detach. And there are spaces as well that will also detach as the wheel comes out. First up, you need to loosen off your axle clamp nut. That's not your main axle nut, but this one at the front here. Then you can have a go at your axle nut. 17mm. Once it's at a certain point, you can completely remove your axle. This is when the wheel's going to want to drop. But I do remember the wheel speed sensor is a bit of a problem, and you have to do something like lifting it and then pivoting the sensor backwards. Let's see if I can remember this. There's your axle. That's it. So you have to lift the wheel, pivot the wheel speed sensor back slightly, and then the wheel will drop. And there's the spacer that I mentioned. Recover that, otherwise it'll just drop out somewhere. And then it's simply a case of rolling the wheel off the wood. Now you can loosen off these 5 disc retaining bolts whilst the wheel is on the bike. If you've got an assistant to hold the brake on for you, that would make the job easier. I don't, so I've gone with this option. Now, that's the disc retaining bolts loosened off, but before we go ahead and remove the disc, they say that if you're not replacing the disc, if you're removing it for another reason, for example, maybe you're getting your wheels refurbished, you need to make sure that the disc goes back on in exactly the same place that it came off. So it's worth marking it. And then apparently you just remove the disc. But the disc has been on here for several years. So is it going to be in a hurry to come off? No, it's not. I suspect a gentle tap is going to be needed. Yes, that's moving. Didn't want to have to do that, but there's no way that was just going to come off like the manual suggests. And lastly, before refitting your disc or fitting your new one, clean up the mounting points on the wheel and the mounting points on the back of your disc. Couple of things to note: make sure that your dust seal is greased because that's where your spacer is going to fit. I've also cleaned up the other side because this is where your wheel speed sensor and dust seal is going to sit on the right hand side, and I will also grease up the actual seal itself on the bike. And the axle itself, this is how I like to store it, because then you don't lose your spacer and your wheel speed sensor isn't just dangling in midair. But it's time to clean and grease the axle. It's interesting to see the wheel speed sensor when nothing else is in the way. You've got this lug at the top here, and the wheel speed sensor itself has these two notches so that the sensor itself just sits on top like this. And that's why when you remove the wheel, you can't just lower the wheel to the ground. You have to lift the wheel slightly, pivot the sensor back to clear that lug, and then the wheel can come out. With everything greased, it's simply a case of getting the wheel into the approximate position and then fitting the wheel speed sensor, followed by the spacer on the other side. And I'm sure there's a fancy way of lifting the wheel off the ground to line the axle up, etc. I don't have anything fancy, so I'll just use my legs to get the wheel into position. And once it's there, you push your axle through, and you shouldn't need anything to, persuade it. But sometimes they can be a little bit difficult. So the slightest bit of persuasion off this today got the axle into place. And then we just tighten it up. 59 Newton meters. And then we tighten up the little pinch bolt at the front here. Pinch bolt I called it. Clamp bolt is what I think it's actually called. 14 Newton meters if you want to get an exact torque on it. Next up is refitting the brake caliper. Slide the caliper back onto the disc, line it up, and you're going to want to thread lock your mounting bolts. 30 Newton meters on these. And because of my headstock stand, I'm going to need an extension bar.